focus at Donor Organizer Hub, we talk about relational fundraising. We're talking about going into communities where you already have those relationships built. So this could be your neighbors, it's your friends, your family, your work colleagues. If you have religious services that you attend, it's people where they already have that trust built in with you. And so where you can kind of leverage and make a difference with that for the organization, and also helping them get out of their own spirals of doomsday, scrolling on social media or getting those New York Times headlines that stress us all out, to be able to match their values with their actions.
Today, we talked to Haley Bash, who is Executive Director of Donor Organizer Hub. Their style of donor organizing is having one-on-ones with friends and sending out BCC'd emails to a list of 150 people 2 to 3 times a year. Haley is passionate about helping each donor organizer find their preferred method of doing this work to raise for underfunded progressive causes. What a great conversation we had with Haley today. I love how fundraising doesn't have to be a high dollar ask, and how everyone can use their own networks to ask for low dollar donations and yet have a huge impact. As you listen, think about ways we can all put this relational style to work with fundraising and organizing to build power in Indiana and red states across the country.
Hello, Haley, and welcome to What the Gerrymander.
We are so excited to have you. I first heard you on a podcast. I remember where I was driving and thinking, oh my gosh, this is like a revelation about how to do fundraising. I would love our listeners who are probably like me, really scared of fundraising. I rage donate all the time. I just click ActBlue and donate, but I've never really done a fundraiser. People I think are a little intimidated by asking for a lot of money. Heidi is very good at it. She ran for State House. And so she's got, that end covered. But I would love to hear from you about how you had the idea. What is Donor Organizer Hub? How did you have the idea? What does it mean? Can you give us a little bit more about your baby?
Yeah, so many juicy questions, and always love talking about the baby. Fundraising, it's interesting because I think I was really fortunate. I grew up in a small town in northern Michigan, and it was a place where people really struggled. But even in that struggle, if somebody's kid was sick, immediately there would be the pancake breakfast fundraiser, and maybe $200, $300 was raised from that. And it was never about the total dollars raised, right? Because under our US healthcare system, if we're talking about cancer treatments, $200 to $300 isn't covering it. But really what was built from that was showing that the community was there for you. There was resiliency, that at each step of the way that people were going to be there for you and offer what they could through the struggle. So I think I just had a little bit of an advantage of, coming into the fundraising world without an understanding as much of the big philanthropic arms and, the sort of dance that we do with major donors. And going into the political space is kind of that stark contrast between how I grew up around fundraising and what fundraising tends to look like in our movement spaces. And I always lovingly and jokingly tell people that donor organizing, as we call it, or, relational fundraising is the oldest form of fundraising, right? We've always, as humans, been asking for what we need and sharing what we can. And when you think from that lens, rather than a lens of sort of transaction of like, I want this from you, I'm getting that out of you, you're asking this of me, I'm getting, I'm giving that to you, it becomes a lot more exciting and a lot less fearful. And I don't mean to simplify it by any means, but at Donor Organizer Hub, what we focus on is cultivating that practice. So supporting everyday people to go into their communities to fundraise, to mobilize resources for movement causes that they care about most. And so they could already be associated with a particular organization or group, or they might do a little bit of research behind the scenes, sort of like the friend who looks up the vacuum cleaner, that could be the best price point for when you have, pets to clean up, that kind of equivalent role to help their friends switch from the Rage Donate button into something that they can be excited about as a collective, and that they know their dollars are going towards something that they believe in and not just something that reflects who bought the Facebook ad that you saw at that particular time when you were upset about Roe being overturned.
So you use the word relational fundraising, and we talk about relational organizing all the time, right? The most effective way to convince somebody of something is to do it with somebody you know and trust. So how does that work with fundraising? Or how does your organization help it to work?
Yeah, and I think if you ask any fundraiser, they'll say all fundraising is relational. That's certainly true. Our focus at Donor Organizer Hub, when we talk about relational fundraising, we're talking about going into communities where you already have those relationships built. So this could be your neighbors, it's your friends, your family, your work colleagues. If you have religious services that you attend, it's people where they already have that trust built in with you. And so where you can kind of leverage and make a difference with that for the organization, and also helping them get out of their own spirals of doomsday, scrolling on social media or getting those New York Times headlines that stress us all out, to be able to match their values with their actions, right? So going back to last year when Roe was overturned, we had a lot of folks that we were supporting and training who were like, I'm upset. All I know about is Planned Parenthood, but maybe what are other ways that I can support? So thinking about, are there local clinics? Are there local abortion funds that maybe need that support and access? And then from there, thinking about, okay, they have a lot of friends that are also pissed off, and having those conversations with them to be able to not only mobilize those resources, but kind of come in and be like, hey, I am so upset and spiraling to, like, where do you need support? How can we be there for one another? Like, how can we be accountability buddies where it lasts beyond this just one-off donation, right? Do we want to host a, little fundraising gathering together to talk to other friends about it? Do we want to join this organizing meet together? So what we think about with the relational fundraising ask is actually it's an invitation not just to donate money, but also to think about what's our plan and next step together that we can do so that we can combat our collective hopelessness and turn that into the sort of political power that we have.
That's interesting. So it's actually more like almost a two-step thing that's happening here. One is you're training folks on how to do that fundraising, but then very quickly you segue into next steps about how to harness the energy that's there. So two things I'm thinking about. One is, what does that training actually look like and sound like? So how do people first engage with you to learn about how to do fundraising? And then what does that training look like?
Yeah, I mean, people come from us in all different ways. Oftentimes it's through, oh, my friend told me about you, or I heard about you on this podcast. But our quick and dirty intake process is we just have a 15-minute call with folks just to check in on where you are, who are your people, where are you kind of focused at in terms of, you have an organization that you're affiliated with? Are you looking to build more community? What are your goals here? And then we can kind of think of a more customized plan of next steps for them. Oftentimes what it looks like in terms of the training journey is we don't dive right into how to make the fundraising ask as much as people are kind of like, I want to develop these skills. Oftentimes because of our own fears of fundraising, it can kind of feel like that dental cleaning, it's like, okay, I have to go, then I'll have to reschedule again 6 months. Like there's no joy in it, right? And relational fundraising, honestly, if you are feeling like that is the worst nightmare in your world, like that's not the place that we want you to be in. Like this is a space where we're building relationships together. So we actually tend to focus on people's personal histories to money, personal relationships to money, and kind of understanding that first, because no matter where we come across from in the class spectrum, we have our own connection or often disconnection to money and asking for support. Once we understand that a bit more, then we get into the piece of thinking about what are our goals that are inclusive of raising money, but also do we want to do a certain hobby more? Do we want to gather with our people more? Thinking about bigger things beyond total dollars that we want to raise. Then we talk about like, okay, now that we have this plan here, we have this vision of, oh, I would love to get to know my neighbors better and we could host a block party together. Then we start to think about, all right, what does that fundraising ask look like? Is it going to be in a larger group setting? Is it one-on-one sort of asks? Depending on what that is, helping people develop their own story. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of us on the left of center, we love thinking about data and facts and backing things up. And not to say that that isn't important, but even the most self-identified logical people are swayed by our passion, are swayed by our commitment more so than by the facts and figures and the stakes at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in the delivery, right? They want to feel moved by you, right? So you have to communicate in a passionate but authentic way. Otherwise, that inauthenticity, it just doesn't get you anywhere. Haley, do folks come to you to learn how to do fundraising as it relates to politics, or is it a whole host of different fundraising streams? What do you focus on?
We focus, I would call it broadly, on the movement space. So anybody that's focused on building what we would call political power. So there is the electoral side, there's advocacy and policy side, and there are also other avenues that, communities use and develop to build power, whether it's mobilizing on the streets or thinking about creative campaigns to target a specific, say, council member or corporation, but thinking about where there are opportunities for people to see that through being around one another and through being able to build skills together, that there's a greater sort of shift in power where we have a more democratic representation. So it's a big tent, but for example, somebody that's doing a campaign for saving puppies, as much as I love puppies, that might not be in the bucket of our sort of fundraising training and work.
It's good to note. So there are parameters to your services and your organization. Awesome.
What I love is the idea of building community with Hoosier Victory Alliance. We're just getting started, and among the things that we're thinking about beyond, how do we fund ourselves? How do we get people we know to support us, to think about us in that way? It's how do we build community, and how do we build coalitions and relationships so that we're not all working at cross purposes, even though we're supposed to be working for the same goal. So I love the idea where you talk about building community within the context of fundraising. We just talked to Jonathan Zucker, who started Every State Blue, and we would love to be part of that. And that idea is crowdfunding, right? Which is asking people to give just a little bit on a recurring basis to fund every single state legislative race. And built into that, they have community. So how does the idea or the execution of building community help with getting people to become donor organizers or be better at it or feel comfortable with it?
I think anybody who's broadly been in an organizer role knows that oftentimes, your first entry point often is from being asked by somebody to show up. And then what has you stay is the relationships that you're able to build, right? Or if you've had maybe a less than ideal organizing experience somewhere, you showed up at the orientation meeting and nobody came up and chatted with you afterward and you didn't know anybody and it felt like there was an in crowd. So a lot of this, when we think about, because our goal is to build lifelong donor organizers, not just for one cycle, but really thinking of how we can have this role and identity for ourselves where we know we're doing what we can throughout the course of our lives. It really is about welcoming people from the start, welcoming people where they are. And I think a lot of that also is taking away from the language of don't just donate and instead shifting that, because for a lot of us, that is our entry point into politics, into broader social justice movement spaces. And instead of saying don't just donate, actually embodying those values and saying like, hey, I really appreciate you donating. We're having a monthly gathering meeting. Would you want to come with me? Just kind of thinking about, instead of, I guess, shaming people for, what they're doing, what they know how to do, like when Roe gets overturned, like a lot of us did, click that donate button, and using that as an opportunity to invite people in, because more people donate than they vote, more people donate than they volunteer, more people donate than they go to church services at this point. And so when we're thinking about how do we connect with our base actually is a lot of grassroots donors. And so thinking about that connection point as an open invitation and not a shame point to say you should be doing more than just donate.
Wow. So one of the things that we're struggling with is people seem to like to donate for a specific race or for a specific person well, mostly a candidate. And in a lot of states like Indiana, you have to build political power first, and that takes money. And then you start running more people, and then you start winning more. Like, look at Wisconsin. They started more than a decade ago, and all of a sudden they have a Supreme Court justice outperforming Biden. And that took a whole lot of organizing and a whole lot of donating and a whole lot of people coming together for a really long time. So how have you found the idea of the concept of infrastructure building versus this particular candidate or that particular organization, like Planned Parenthood or Heidi Beidinger, or building infrastructure? It sounds kind of, but it's the thing that's going to raise everybody else up.
Yeah, I think so much of that sort of battle of infrastructure versus like the red to blue candidate kind of thing does come from a place of us not thinking about or prioritizing community as much in our conversations. And we're kind of leading in instead with, here's the, 538 views on what is going to be the most strategic. None of us have a crystal ball, right?
Right.
And at the end of the day, I mean, there are many great organizations out there that are doing both forward thinking and backwards thinking on what happened in 2022, what's coming in 2024. I think it comes down to thinking about starting with, what do you have right now? And so when we work with organizations that have lower resources or access, or it feels like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming compared to all the access points that these other big national organizations get, the number 3 is really powerful. There's some science around triangles and, human dynamics, where if you can just get a group of 3 people together, this could be, for a small organization, it could be a staff member, a board member, and a volunteer. For a campaign, it could be the candidate, their brother-in-law, and, their neighbor, whatever it is. But starting with just 3 people to start having that conversation of, what can we do together? Do we want to host an event? Do we want to host one-on-ones, a series of one-on-ones with our people? Like, what are we going to do together to be able to raise those resources is a really beautiful start, as long as you're not thinking from the get-go of like, we need to raise $15,000 in this first go. Because let's be honest, it's going to be modest amounts, but it's starting, when we're talking about infrastructure building at the relational fundraising level, it starts from those small groups of superfans that really believe, they're like, Indiana is a long game and it's needed so deeply because that is the hotbed of where MAGA America is doing its best organizing. Persuasion for any campaign, we're talking about field or otherwise, like, you talk to your base first, then you get into the persuasion universe. And I think in our fundraising world, we're like, let's go to persuasion first because they're the big ticket ones. And we don't think about like our people that we already have supporting us.
Yeah, boy, that's good food for thought. And Stephanie, I like the way you set it up between donations for infrastructure versus donations for a candidate. And here in Indiana, because we are so red, our infrastructure is weak. Candidates are recruited here and they are thanked for running. And then they're like, we'll see you in November, right? And so we're left sort of standing there going, I don't know how to fundraise. I don't know how to organize people. What do I do tomorrow? I filed today. What do I do tomorrow? And so what I find really energizing about this conversation, and having done a number of podcasts now, is that we are bubbling up the resources that are available now for candidates to go out and get these kinds of resources and this kind of training. Honestly, that I swear it didn't exist last summer. And suddenly now it just seems like there's a lot more happening. Of course, we had Wisconsin, and then we've got Michigan, who last fall went to a trifecta. Mm-hmm. Surely that should help us do some fundraising in Indiana to be able to say, see, the other ones can do it, and we can do it too.
Yeah.
Where have you been in those other states? Do you have stories from those states where you've been successful?
In both those states, yes. And in both times, they were invested deeply in their own communities to develop those resources. The decision of distributing those resources now for The Illinois folks, a lot of it went out the door in other states. And in Michigan, they kept it within. I come from a blue state right now as well. I live in California. We have seen what happens when we totally ignore blue states or blue districts, because California and New York got very hit. That's why we lost the House predominantly last cycle. But they did focus on building power in their communities. And their communities aren't necessarily bounded by state lines. Like, my brother lives in Michigan still, like I have friends in New York, but thinking about who are your people first, rather than the traditional nonprofit route of, getting that donor database and trying to, figure out how do we persuade this like random rich person who's getting 1 million requests. How about instead, like a lot of people in Indiana right now are not being asked to help, build infrastructure for Indiana. That could be a great sounding point and start point. There's also, when we think about disbursements of funds, right? There's this difference between raising for ourselves and raising in solidarity for other areas. And, there really could be some relationship building that's worth exploring, for Indiana folk and Illinois, because the right-winger things that are happening in Indiana do impact what then is happening in Illinois. We work with that, I would say are run by white, upper middle class retirees, all volunteer led, and they'll fundraise for youth-led Black and Brown organizing. And so that kind of dynamic, and just having it be an explicit relationship where it's not, oh, we're doing this nice thing and being charitable to you. It's like we are both learning and growing from each other. That can be a really fruitful place to build community outside of your original community too.
So if some of our listeners are brand new to this, and as you said, fundraising is super scary, asking people for money, right? How do you talk about the work that you do, the Donor Hub, and how do you compare that to like the high-end donors, the ones that you talk about that they get asked over and over and over again, right? And then talk about like the differences between this and probably why we need to be doing both, right?
Yeah, we absolutely need to be doing both. The way that Donor Organizer Hub we think about where we focus on is the folks that aren't getting asked all the time, that aren't part of donor networks. They don't have advisors. They aren't invited to galas. These are the people, and this is anywhere from poor, working class to middle class and upper middle class. They're the people where when they make a donation, at best, they're given an auto-generated email that has an EIN number. At worst, and we're seeing this more and more, their inboxes and their phones are getting spammed at a wazoo. And so for those people, that is currently their welcome wagon into our movements, right? It's like that and maybe the GOTV text that they get the day before elections. And so the donation ask really is an opportunity to rebuild people's distrust with politics. And they trust you. They trust you as an emerging leader in the space, whether you're running for office for the first time, whether you're starting a new organization, or you're the support person that makes it all possible. You are taking that courageous step, and they love and admire that about you already. You can be that bridge for them to have even an ounce of more faith in the political process.
That is so important. We all get all of those emails. I just walked out of a meeting and I need to raise $15,000 in the next hour and a half or else it's all doomed. And obviously it must work, right? Or else they'd stop doing it, but it feels really gross.
It doesn't work for me anymore. So that's why having a new approach, Haley, is really attractive. And doing relational fundraising. I hadn't thought about relational fundraising quite like that before. And I love the idea that everybody can learn how to do relational fundraising.
Yeah, such a big part of our mission is figuring out what makes sense for you as an individual. I know for me personally, I have done big event fundraising asks, but I am just not the person to get into a room of 1,000 people and speak the beautiful gospel. I am much better at, say, one-on-one asks. I'm much better at small group asks. Knowing thyself and being able to customize based on that makes it so that we go from the space of, oh God, fundraising is so scary, I can't do it, to like, okay, I'm still a little nervous here, but there's a growth edge here. Like I can take this on. And such a big piece of that is, I think, oftentimes on the left, we take our fundraising anxiety and we're like, oh, so people want to fundraise for us. Let's create a house party toolkit. And that house party toolkit, because, we're like, oh, we want everybody to feel prepared. It actually stresses people out more. They're like, this is a big, scary, this just feels like, oh God, I'm getting the anxiety again of what if nobody comes to my 7th Burger King birthday party? Nobody shows up. This organization expected a lot of me. So trying to peel back, no, it's really actually not that hard or scary. Raising anything above $0 is so needed for under-resourced organizations and candidates, and any dang person can do it. Somebody out there who can donate $1.
Wow. I remember you saying one of the things that really grabbed me, which was everyone knows somebody who can donate $1, but also almost all of us know enough people that can make small donations to add up to $1,000.
Correct.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we're doing as an organization is we're putting together how to run a campaign, which admittedly is different than how to host a house party, because people have already signed up to run. And I'm sure, and we know that they say, okay, what the hell do I do now? And we want to do that for them. But the idea that no matter who you are, enough people that you could ask for $10, $20, $100, even $5 will add up. That, you don't have to be asking for $1 million or 50,000 or, even 200. Just keeping at it will get you pretty far.
And that's just you, right? And if you're talking about taking the brave steps of running for office, you can take the brave step of asking other people closest to you to each raise $200, and because they have their own networks of people. We all don't work at the same place, go to the same religious services, live in the same neighborhood. It really is about being strategic and honorable about your asks and saying, hey, I'm learning these ropes of running for office. It's very big and scary. The filing fees are X dollars. I'm committed to raising Y dollars. Could you help me out and raise Z dollars? If people know the stakes at hand, which oftentimes these spammy emails don't get us at, right? It's all confusing and just anxiety inducing. But if we're very honest with people, a small organization could say hey, here's our budget that we kind of scrapped together. We're trying to hit here. We would love if this group together could help us raise, this amount of that. Naming the stakes, I think, can do a lot to also just take away the anxiety, because you're actually able to share in that with others. You took that brave step as an individual, but your community is going to ultimately support you in that big step.
I'm wondering about the first time you took your first big step and what that story looked like, and then, how you felt going into it. And then on the other side of it, how did you feel?
It was a long time after the pancake breakfast as a child. I was 22 years old. I had just moved to Oakland. I went to a Showing Up for Racial Justice Bay Area intro meeting, and they kind of show their different committees. I didn't really know where I was going to land. I was just like, oh, I'm living in a city with such rich Black history and such a rich history of anti-Blackness. And as a white gentrifier, I should, do what I can. I didn't know what that looked like. The person that ran the fundraising committee stood up on this table and just yelled, fundraising is organizing. And it kind of clicked all back with me, back in my childhood roots, kind of strangely into a very different spot, living as a city dweller in the Bay Area at the time as a software engineer, where I was like, oh yeah, I have a lot of other 20-something friends that are making 6 figures right now. They have the same values that I do, and they're not being asked to distribute resources in a way that feels meaningful to them, where they can feel like I am aligning my behaviors with my values. And so I took that step to join that committee. I had no idea what I was doing and never fundraised before in my life. We did all these fun experimental things because at the time Showing Up for Racial Justice had, I think, 3 staff. They were deep in Appalachia, trying to figure themselves out. And so you learned the ropes of the limitations of email fundraising. There's only so much you can blast to your list, and then you got to start building relationships. And look, when you build those relationships with people, the relationships that you actually already have, people are not going to be like, oh, I never want to talk to you again because you asked me for money. They're actually going to be flattered. They're going to be flattered that you asked. They're going to be feeling so excited because they have something to do. I think a lot of us are sort of spiraling of, I want to make an impact, but where is my role? What are the next steps? And they're going to be excited to be invited in more, whatever that next step invitation after the donation looks like for them. So it was a really lovely and humbling journey to go back to my rural roots and get the sense of, oh, at first I thought it was all transactional. Like you build this list and you ask people for money. That runs dry very quickly without relationships. Oh, neat. Like go into our communities and start making those asks that feel scary at first, but actually it makes us all better through that ask.
So, my PhD is in leadership. So I have studied transactional, really management, right? And then transformational leadership. And I have to be honest that when I was doing the fundraising and then, you're being told sort of that, hey, you've got to call these 10 big donors. And I'm like, I don't have a relationship with them. Like, I believe in relational leadership and transformational leadership. I have to have some sort of connection with folks before I can just go in and say, can you give me $5,000 or $10,000? I thought that this was somewhat ludicrous. So in some ways, I may have picked up on your principles of what you're talking about because of the studying that I had done before. But I took a longer time then to do that the first phone call wasn't about just zeroing in on an ask. It actually was more about, why do you donate in this space? Who do you donate? It's like what you said. What values are aligned? How do you put your money in places that align with your values, right? And so had those conversations first. And truthfully, what I thought was going to be like these short conversations actually ended up being longer, more meaningful conversations because it took the time to have those conversations. And then I ended up not having to, call back a second time to say, could I have that donation? So what I'm saying, Haley, is that I'm validating exactly what you're saying, and I can see how it applies to small donations as well as the large donations.
Totally. And that principle has been, such best practice for major gifts folks, people that are going to major donors. I mean, at the worst end of things, major donors have been exposed to very transactional asks, but oftentimes what's considered to be best practice is it does take 6 to 18 months of what's called cultivation of a major donor to go from that relationship build to be able to make that ask. Oftentimes in our space, what's kind of been established is like, oh, you only get that treatment if you can donate above a certain amount. If you're below that certain amount, you're going to get the email, like maybe an inspirational email, but it's nonetheless like nobody knows who you are. It's a mail merge to get your first name down there. And it just kind of reflects on, how we treat everyday people sometimes on the left, is like, okay, we'll dance for the rich people and everybody else, like...
That's exactly right. And so that's why also people feel like they're not invited in, right? Mm-hmm. That we say we have a big tent and that we're really inclusive, but that in fact, because we're courting all the big donors all the time, it's like you said, you have all these friends who are making 6 figures and nobody was asking them. So they don't feel included. They don't feel part of the tent. And so they're not giving their money. And it's so important for us to be thinking about how to expand that relational fundraising and letting people know that they can spend their money in a way that aligns with their values, right? Yeah. I think that's probably one of the key messages. I'm wondering for our listeners, Haley, what would you recommend as next steps? So they hear you, they're excited about relational fundraising, and maybe that they're still terrified. Let's not kid ourselves. But for some folks will be listening going, relational fundraising, that seems to make sense to me that I could raise $100 this afternoon, for something, right? For a person or for infrastructure. What would you say to them now as our listeners? What are the next steps for them?
I mean, if you need any support at all, and support could look like a variety of things, right? Support could be like, I'm afraid that fundraising ask. Support could be like, I don't know what to wear when meeting with my friends. Some folks it's emotional, some folks it's logistical, some folks it's both and. Go to donororganizerhub.org, sign up for a slot to talk with us. We are excited to work with you and figure out how you can take that brave first step so that you can go from being hopeless and spiraling or nervous about fundraising to a space where, yeah, you raise $100 from friends in an afternoon, or no matter where your access space is, you're able to raise $1,000 for something that you really care about.
Right.
Oh, I think that giving people a way that they can take action right now, things feel so big, right? Every time you get on the TV or social media or listen to a podcast, the problems are so large that it feels for a lot of people so overwhelming that they're paralyzed. Personally, I deal with that by action. And that's how, when people say, how can you do that? That's my answer is that's why I do this, because otherwise I would spiral into the pit of despair. But to think that, those people really can do something and they don't have to just sit there and listen. And for the listeners out there, you're allowed to take breaks also.
Good advice.
And yes. Actually, you don't have to go on Truth Social to find out what they're saying. You don't need to do that. All you have to do is do some action and you'll feel a lot better. But that there really are small steps that they can take that make a huge difference as they add up over time. And that's the only way we're going to get through this, is by everybody doing a little bit and what they can and listening to some podcast randomly and having some brilliant idea, different way of thinking about things, different perspective. So having you on and hopefully giving one person an idea that they didn't have before, right, with any luck, more than one person. But I think that's how we have to build smaller movements within the larger movement. And so having you give people an entry point, I think, is really important and very welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, we are in such, when we talk about the social isolation crisis of all time, and also it really creates an opportunity for us to build those bridges in community through resourcing. We want to help one another and we want to help our communities. And there's just honestly no better time than right now to start reaching out to your people and thinking about ways that you can go from that sort of spiraling, staring at your ceiling fan, wondering what next terrible headline's going to come through versus what really cool action can you create together to mobilize some money for a local organization you care a lot about. Is it going to involve salsa dancing? How cool is that? A lot better than staring at that ceiling fan.
Okay. Is there anything that you wanted to say beyond salsa dancing that we didn't ask you about that you think people should know?
I think it's important to acknowledge that poor and working class people have disproportionately funded and built our movements throughout the course of history, and especially in the most successful moments of our movement history. And by saying that people are too broke to donate, or that this should be for wealthy folks, and frontlines folks should only focus on frontline direct actions, it's not actually aligning holistically with how we are as humans. We both want to take direct action and we want to support the inputs needed to take that action. And so when we say, oh, somebody's too broke to donate, we're taking that one piece of agency from somebody that already has a lot of pieces of agency taken away from them.
Because when we say you're too broke to donate, you're exactly right. We're assuming, we're making all kinds of assumptions, and the world is already making assumptions, and we're taking away their power. If they want to donate $1 or $5, then we need to give people the opportunity to be able to participate, right? Instead of just assuming that there's no way that they are going to participate. But that's a powerful message. We need to remember that people want to be included. And what do we always say on election day? That we're all equal, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody's vote is exactly the same. So why, when it comes to that fundraising piece, do we suddenly say, I don't need your money, or I'm not going to ask this group of people, but let me go ask these 10 donors who donate to everything in Indiana, including more people. And as you said already, people will be excited to be invited in. So,
and we have to do a good job of thanking them and then bringing them in further.
Yes.
As the people on the receiving end. Yeah.
Bringing in further is that's key.
Really welcoming people, into our doorsteps. So often we think about it only in election times, but there's only so many election days every 4 years. And so what are those other access points where we can really build those deeper relationships between election cycles? I love any and all opportunities to hang out with fellow Midwestern folk and really excited about the work that y'all are doing.
Thanks for listening to What the Gerrymander. We're working toward building Blue Indiana and ask that you make a small recurring donation at HoosierVictoryAlliance.org. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. We thank you, and democracy thanks you.